The scent of expensive champagne mingled with rotting garbage the moment my father pointed toward a flimsy plastic chair tucked in the corner. He smirked, convinced he had finally put his failure of a daughter in her proper place before 500 elite guests. Neither he nor the laughing crowd realized the woman calmly sitting beside the trash bin had purchased their entire future exactly 1 hour ago. Tonight, this 30-year family power game officially ends. Hello to all the wonderful listeners of Haley Revenge Stories. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with absolutely zero budget to operate. If you enjoy today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our hardworking staff, allowing them to afford their living expenses and continue creating these stories for you. You can donate by scanning the PayPal QR code on your screen or by clicking the PayPal link in the description or the comments section below. I am 32 years old, and tonight, I drove my car up to the valet stand of the most opulent country club in Austin, Texas. The valet, a young man wearing a crisp uniform that probably cost more than a month of my rent, handed me a ticket without bothering to look me in the eye. That was perfectly fine. I was entirely accustomed to being invisible, especially when the event revolved around my older brother. Tonight was the glorious coronation of Marcus Wilson. He was officially celebrating his promotion to regional manager, a title that sounded incredibly prestigious if you were completely unaware that his corporate employer was slowly bleeding out in the market. But to the Wilson family, Marcus was the golden boy. He was the shining pride, the unquestionable proof of my father's supposed genetic superiority and parenting genius. I stepped inside the grand ballroom. Crystal chandeliers hung suspended from the vaulted ceilings, casting a warm, expensive, and utterly pretentious glow over the sea of local politicians and wealthy businessmen. They had all gathered here to gorge themselves on complimentary filet mignon and stroke each other's egos. Holding court in the very center of the room was my father, Arthur Wilson. He was a man hopelessly obsessed with social status, brand names, and the traditional, outdated ladders of prestige. I watched him from the shadows of the entryway, wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo, holding a heavy glass of single malt scotch. He was laughing far too loudly at a remarkably mediocre joke told by a local city councilman. My father patted shoulders, shook hands vigorously, and radiated the specific kind of hollow practice charm that only men who measure their human worth by their zip codes can ever truly master. I walked quietly over to the mahogany reception desk and signed the guest book. A sleek, silver-plated seating chart was proudly displayed on an easel, listing the VIP tables explicitly designated for the family and close dignitaries. I scanned the elegantly embossed gold leaf names: Arthur Wilson, Marcus Wilson. I saw the names of a few aunts and uncles who miraculously only appeared when there was top-tier free champagne flowing. I checked table 1, then I meticulously checked table 2, then table 3. My name was absolutely nowhere to be found on that shiny board. I did not panic. I simply turned away from the gold leaf letters and followed the perimeter of the room, letting the heavy, suffocating scent of roasted garlic, rich perfumes, and pure arrogance wash over me. I kept walking until the plush velvet carpets abruptly gave way to scuffed, hard linoleum. There it was. In the dimly lit catering cleanup area, stationed right next to the swinging kitchen doors, sat a large, gray industrial trash bin reeking heavily of discarded seafood and sour wine. Right beside that bin was a flimsy, cheap plastic folding chair. It was completely out of place, an ugly blemish in the middle of this magnificent, floral-scented hall. Resting haphazardly on the edge of the prep table next to it was a torn, handwritten name card. The ink was slightly smudged, but I could clearly read it. Olivia Wilson. That corner fits a lowly IT worker. I turned around slowly. My father, Arthur, had marched over, deliberately projecting his voice so it would carry perfectly over the smooth jazz playing in the background. Several guests standing nearby abruptly paused their networking conversations, their eyes darting toward the scene with hungry predatory curiosity. "Sit there so you do not ruin your brother's frame," Arthur continued. He offered a half-smile that was meant to look like a playful, endearing family joke to the onlookers, but up close, it dripped with pure, unfiltered malice. He desperately wanted an audience. He wanted to assert his absolute dominance by reducing his own daughter to a pathetic punchline in front of Austin's elite. I simply glanced over his broad shoulder. Marcus was standing just a few feet away, tightly gripping a crystal flute of champagne. Our eyes met for a fleeting fraction of a second. Instead of stepping forward, instead of speaking up to defend his younger sister, Marcus offered a tight, incredibly awkward smile. Then, like the coward he had always been, he quickly turned his head the other way and began chatting with a waiter. He chose silence. He always chose silence if it meant protecting his flawless, carefully curated image. My father stood there, his chest puffed out slightly beneath his tailored suit, waiting for the inevitable tears. He was practically vibrating with anticipation, waiting for me to grab my purse, lower my head in deep shame, and run crying out the front doors. That way, he could spend the rest of the evening shaking his head and telling the politicians how emotionally unstable and jealous his daughter was. Instead, I looked down at the plastic chair. I looked at the gray trash bin. Then, I looked back into Arthur's expectant eyes. I calmly reached out and pulled the flimsy chair back, the cheap plastic legs scraping loudly and obnoxiously against the linoleum floor. I sat down. I gracefully took off my coat and draped it neatly over the back of the chair. I picked up the glass of plain tap water resting next to my smudged name card, took a slow, deliberate sip, and smiled right at my father. The look of profound confusion that washed over his face was priceless. I crossed my legs, completely comfortable, and settled in to watch the Wilson family play out their pathetic little theater. The microphone fed a piercing shriek of feedback through the ballroom speakers, followed by a booming voice. A senior vice president of Marcus's firm was standing at the podium, gripping the edges of the wooden stand and delivering a painfully rehearsed, aggressively hollow tribute. He called my brother a visionary leader and a strategic mastermind. From my plastic chair next to the kitchen doors, where the unmistakable stench of old shrimp shells wafted over me every few seconds, the speech sounded like a perfectly tuned comedy routine. I rested my chin on my hand, letting my mind drift backward. The contrast between the golden light bathing Marcus on stage and the dim, greasy shadows hiding me in the corner was practically the defining metaphor of my entire existence. When we were children, Marcus bringing home a report card with a solid average grade in mathematics resulted in an extravagant steak dinner to celebrate his undeniable effort. When I won the statewide Advanced Robotics Championship at 14 years old, Arthur barely glanced at the towering trophy. He just sighed, adjusted his tie, and told me that girls who tinkered with wires rarely found good husbands. My brilliance was never viewed as an asset. It was viewed as an irritating act of rebellion, a stubborn refusal to fit into the quiet, decorative mold he had designed for me. My father was a man who worshipped at the altar of visibility. If a job did not come with a corner office, a flashy corporate title, and a heavy brass nameplate, it was utterly worthless. That was exactly why he treated my career with such venomous disdain. Whenever relatives asked about me during the holidays, Arthur would roll his eyes and mention my company, Aegis Vanguard Systems. He always spat the name out as if it were a humiliating disease. "She fixes computer glitches," he would tell my aunts loudly, ensuring I was well within earshot. "A little IT repair shop. I keep telling her to ask Marcus for an administrative job at his firm, but she is too proud to admit she failed." He truly believed I spent 40 hours a week crawling under dusty wooden desks, untangling power cords, and rebooting frozen operating systems for minimum wage. I never bothered to correct him. I never told him that Aegis Vanguard Systems was not a storefront in a strip mall. It was the most secretive, high-level private cyber intelligence and data security organization operating in the United States. We did not reset passwords. We built the invisible digital fortresses that protected the intellectual property of aerospace defense contractors, international financial institutions, and global tech monopolies. And I was not a low-level technician. I was the founder and the chief architect. I held the master keys to empires. The heavy, ornate oak doors at the front of the ballroom swung open again. A fresh wave of Austin's true power players began to filter into the hall. These were the venture capitalists, the elite board members, and the tech giants who controlled the city's economic heartbeat. They had arrived strictly to maintain appearances with the aging corporation Marcus worked for. They glided across the room in bespoke suits and designer gowns, completely bypassing the catering cleanup area. A few of them brushed so close to my plastic chair that the silk of their garments grazed my knee. Not a single person looked down. To them, a woman sitting quietly beside an industrial trash bin was simply part of the janitorial scenery, completely unworthy of their oxygen. Suddenly, a sharp, singular vibration pulsed against my thigh. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my heavily modified, encrypted device. I tilted the screen away from the glare of the kitchen lights. A single text message materialized on the black interface sent from my lead acquisition director. "The deal is sealed. Entering the lobby." I read the words twice, feeling the immense, crushing weight of 30 years of family history pressing down on my shoulders. I pressed the power button, plunging the screen back into absolute darkness. I looked up. On the brightly lit stage, Arthur had taken the microphone from the vice president. He was raising a crystal glass of champagne high above his head, his face flushed with triumph as he toasted his golden boy. He looked so incredibly proud, so deeply convinced that he had successfully engineered a dynasty of winners and properly discarded the one loser. I sat back in my cheap plastic chair, watching his joyous smile. A quiet, suffocating ache bloomed in my chest. I genuinely wondered, in that fleeting moment, if things could have been different. If I had simply shown him my bank accounts, if I had flaunted my power, would he have loved me? Would he have ever looked at me with that same glowing adoration if there were no material halos attached to my name? The answer, harsh and cold, settled into my bones. No. He only loved the reflection of his own ego. Tonight, I was going to shatter every single mirror in his house. The smooth saxophone melody flowing through the ballroom was abruptly shattered by the blinding glare of high-beam headlights. Outside the massive, floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the country club, a synchronized fleet of 4 matte black, heavily armored sport utility vehicles violently mounted the circular driveway. The screech of thick rubber halting on the pavement pierced the glass. The low, aggressive rumble of their massive engines vibrated through the crystal champagne flutes, resting on the delicate VIP tables. The heavy double doors of the main entrance were forcefully thrown open. 6 men wearing identical dark suits and discreet earpieces fanned out into the lobby. They moved with the cold, mechanical precision of apex predators, their eyes scanning the room and immediately establishing a hard perimeter. The jazz band abruptly stopped playing right in the middle of a note. The cheerful, arrogant chatter of 500 guests instantly died in their throats. The silence that fell over the magnificent hall was heavy, sudden, and absolutely terrifying. Then, Elias Thorne walked through the entrance. He was a phantom in the physical world, a man who possessed an estimated net worth of over $80 billion, but had ruthlessly destroyed any journalist who attempted to publish a photograph of him in the last decade. He was universally whispered about as the puppet king of Silicon Valley, the man who quietly bought and sold sovereign digital infrastructures before his morning coffee. He absolutely did not attend regional management promotion parties in Texas. He did not mingle with minor corporate executives. Yet, here he was, wearing a bespoke charcoal suit with an open collar and no tie, exuding an aura of absolute crushing authority that made the expansive ballroom feel instantly claustrophobic. His name was definitely not on the silver-plated guest list. From my flimsy plastic chair by the kitchen, I watched the sheer panic detonate on the brightly lit stage. Arthur and Marcus froze completely, their celebratory glasses suspended awkwardly in midair. It took their socially obsessed brains exactly 2 seconds to recognize the magnitude of the titan standing in their doorway. All the color rapidly drained from my brother's face, instantly replaced by a feverish, desperate greed. Arthur furiously grabbed Marcus by the elbow, hissing panicked instructions into his ear. Both men began frantically adjusting their silk ties and smoothing the lapels of their expensive jackets. They scrambled down the stage steps, abandoning all pretense of dignity. They rudely shoved their way past a local state senator and the chief executive officer of a major bank, desperate to be the first ones to grovel. They needed to secure their proximity to the most powerful human being they had ever laid eyes on. Marcus reached the front of the frozen crowd, planting his polished shoes firmly in Elias's path. He pasted on his most practiced, sickeningly confident corporate smile. He thrust his right hand forward, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride, fully believing that the puppet king of the tech world had flown halfway across the country specifically to acknowledge the stellar reputation of his mediocre corporate branch. "Mr. Thorne," Marcus announced, his voice practically trembling with overwhelming self-importance. "What an absolute honor to welcome you to my celebration tonight. We are profoundly thrilled to have you here to witness." Elias Thorne did not even blink. He did not slow his pace by a single fraction of a second. He walked directly through the physical space Marcus was occupying, forcing my older brother to stumble awkwardly backward into a waiter to avoid being completely trampled. Arthur, terrified of losing this golden networking opportunity, aggressively stepped forward and extended his own hand, eager to introduce himself as the patriarch of this supposedly brilliant family. Elias simply raised his left arm and coldly swatted Arthur's hand away with the back of his wrist. He did not look at my father. He treated Arthur exactly like an irritating insect buzzing too close to his face. A collective gasp rippled through the hundreds of elite guests. No one moved. No one dared to breathe. Elias stood dead center in the ballroom. His piercing, icy eyes slowly swept across the sea of frozen politicians, the glittering chandeliers, and the untouched VIP tables adorned with extravagant white roses. He ignored all of it. His gaze bypassed the gold leaf names entirely. His eyes locked onto the darkest, shabbiest corner of the hall. He saw the scuffed linoleum floor. He saw the swinging kitchen doors. He saw the large gray trash bin. Without uttering a single word to the breathless crowd, the billionaire adjusted his jacket, stepped away from the bewildered socialites, and began taking long, purposeful strides straight toward the garbage. The rhythmic, heavy click of Elias Thorne's leather dress shoes, echoing against the scuffed linoleum, sounded like a judge striking a wooden gavel. He had completely abandoned the plush, velvet-carpeted sanctuary of the main VIP section. The sea of 500 elite politicians and wealthy executives parted for him like a flock of terrified sheep, creating a wide, unobstructed path directly to the catering cleanup area. He marched straight past the towering, $10,000 floral arrangements without sparing them a single glance. He ignored the frantic, pathetic whimpers of a state senator trying desperately to catch his attention. He walked until the expensive soles of his shoes stopped exactly 3 feet away from my wobbly plastic chair. The air in the room grew so incredibly dense, it felt as though the oxygen had been entirely sucked through the ceiling ventilation shafts. Elias stood tall, his broad shoulders blocking the harsh glare of the kitchen lights. He did not pinch his nose at the revolting stench of the gray trash bin resting right beside me. Instead, he calmly reached down, fastened the middle button of his bespoke charcoal jacket, and lowered his upper body. It was a precise, deliberate, 15-degree bow. In the cutthroat, viciously arrogant hierarchy of the technological underworld, it was the ultimate gesture of submission and absolute respect. "Boss Wilson," Elias said. His voice was incredibly smooth, carrying a rich, dark resonance that easily sliced through the suffocating silence of the ballroom. "I did not think your new office would have such a minimalist style." The entire ballroom collectively inhaled, producing a sharp, ragged sound that bounced off the vaulted ceilings. A chaotic symphony of horrified gasps and frantic whispers immediately erupted. Standing a few yards away, Arthur's jaw literally unhinged. The heavy crystal champagne flute slipped right through his trembling fingers, shattering violently against the hard floor and splashing expensive liquor all over his tailored trousers. He did not even flinch at the sound of the breaking glass. He simply stared at Elias, his eyes wide and bulging with a terrifying mixture of absolute shock and catastrophic confusion. His brain, rigidly wired to worship traditional corporate titles and flashy business cards, was violently short-circuiting as it tried to process exactly why the undisputed king of Silicon Valley was bowing to his supposedly disgraced daughter. Next to him, Marcus looked as though he had just been physically struck by a speeding freight train. All the blood rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin an unnatural, sickly shade of gray. He stood completely frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish, utterly incapable of forming a single coherent syllable. Elias slowly straightened his posture. He did not bother to look at my father or my brother. He turned his piercing, icy gaze toward the sweating country club manager, who was currently cowering near the kitchen double doors. The billionaire casually raised his right hand and snapped his fingers, a sharp, biting sound that cracked through the air like a leather whip. "Clear the main VIP table immediately," Elias commanded, his voice dripping with venomous, unforgiving authority. "Do you have any idea who this woman is? You dare let the strategic partner holding exactly 80% of my global cybersecurity network sit next to this rotting garbage?" Absolute pandemonium broke out among the club staff. 4 terrified waiters sprinted toward the front of the room, violently shoving aside a local tech chief executive officer just to grab a plush, gold-trimmed velvet chair from the head table. They dragged it frantically across the floor, practically tripping over their own feet, and placed it right beside me, begging me with their terrified eyes to stand up and accept the immediate upgrade. I did not move a single muscle. I rested my elbows on the sticky surface of the prep table, interlaced my fingers, and let a cold, slow smile spread across my face. "It is completely fine, Elias," I replied smoothly, making sure my voice carried effortlessly across the silent, breathless crowd. "Do not bother the staff. I actually prefer this seat. From this dark little corner, I can see everyone's true face very clearly." That specific sentence was the ultimate catalyst. It was exactly like dropping a lit match into a sealed room heavily saturated with gasoline. All around the magnificent hall, the sudden sharp glow of hundreds of smartphone screens illuminated the darkness. 500 guests, driven by sheer, unadulterated panic, frantically began typing my name into their search engines. Olivia Wilson. Within seconds, the confused whispers escalated into a frantic, terrified buzz. They were actively digging up the anonymous financial reports. They were finding the deeply buried articles detailing aggressive corporate takeovers. They were reading in real time about the multi-billion-dollar mergers orchestrated by a phantom architect. The missing pieces of the puzzle aggressively snapped together in their minds. The rumors that had leaked earlier in the evening about a massive hostile acquisition suddenly had a terrifying, undeniable face. The physical reaction of the crowd was instantaneous and utterly ruthless. The elite circles of Austin did not survive this long by maintaining loyalty to sinking ships. Recognizing the catastrophic mistake they had just made by actively participating in my public humiliation, the guests began to shuffle backward. The politicians who had been laughing uproariously with Arthur just 10 minutes ago suddenly found the ceiling architecture incredibly fascinating, taking large, deliberate steps away from him. The venture capitalists instantly turned their backs on Marcus. In less than 60 seconds, a massive, glaringly empty radius formed around my father and brother. They were physically and socially quarantined, stranded on a pathetic, isolated island of their own making, slowly realizing they had just aggressively mocked one of the most ruthless and powerful figures in the American underground tech empire. The isolation surrounding my father and brother was absolute and instantaneous. They were entirely marooned on a microscopic island of their own arrogant creation, surrounded by a vast, unforgiving ocean of elite predators who were now actively distancing themselves. The venture capitalists and local politicians who had spent the last 2 hours drinking Arthur's liquor and laughing at his jokes were now staring at him with a mixture of profound disgust and chilling calculation. In the brutal, unforgiving ecosystem of extreme wealth, stupidity was a contagious disease, and no one wanted to stand near ground zero. Arthur's desperate, ingrained survival instincts violently kicked in. It was a masterclass in pathetic, transparent social pivoting. He physically shook off his paralysis, forcing a sickeningly bright, entirely artificial smile onto his face. He practically tripped over his own expensive leather shoes as he lunged across the vast, empty space the crowd had aggressively cleared. He stopped just inches from my flimsy plastic chair, tightly clasping his trembling hands together in a grotesque, nauseating display of fawning adoration. "Oh my goodness, my darling daughter," Arthur gasped. His voice projected with a desperate, warbling pitch, practically begging the influential executives in the back rows to witness his sudden burst of paternal devotion. "Why did you never tell your old man about these magnificent, incredible achievements? I have always known you were the absolute genius of the Wilson family. You were always my brilliant, shining star." I did not laugh. I did not scream at him. I did not harbor a single ounce of fiery, chaotic hatred in my chest. I sat perfectly still in my cheap chair, looking directly into his desperate, bloodshot eyes, and all I felt was a cold, surgical, overwhelming pity. I saw a hollow, aging man who had eagerly traded his own soul and his own flesh and blood for the fleeting approval of strangers in expensive suits. "Dad," I replied, my tone flat, calm, and utterly devoid of mercy. "I personally mailed you the beautifully bound, executive annual reports for my corporation every single December for the past 5 years. You used those thick, glossy pages to line the bottom of the Golden Retriever's food tray because you automatically assumed they were cheap promotional junk mail." A brutal, mocking wave of suppressed laughter rippled through the surrounding crowd of executives. Arthur's face flushed a deep, mottled, agonizing crimson. His jaw slackened, and his desperate, sycophantic smile violently collapsed into an expression of sheer, unadulterated humiliation. He had just been publicly gutted and professionally crucified. He was fully exposed as an arrogant, ignorant fool who could not even recognize a multi-billion-dollar empire when it was delivered directly to his own front porch via certified mail. Before Arthur could formulate a pathetic, stammering excuse, Elias Thorne smoothly turned his back on my father, dismissing him completely. The billionaire strode purposefully toward the brightly illuminated stage. The crowd parted instantly, giving him a wide, respectful berth. Elias climbed the carpeted steps with the predatory, undeniable grace of a man who owned the very air he breathed. He walked straight past the trembling corporate vice president, reached out, and forcefully snatched the heavy metal microphone directly from the hands of the master of ceremonies. Elias did not tap the microphone to test the sound. He did not offer a polite, rehearsed evening greeting. He simply leaned into the heavy wooden podium, his dark, calculating eyes sweeping over the terrified, breathless sea of guests. "I believe there has been a profound, almost comical misunderstanding regarding the specific nature of my presence in this city tonight," Elias began. His rich, authoritative voice echoed ominously off the crystal chandeliers, commanding the absolute attention of every single heartbeat in the room. "I absolutely did not fly halfway across the country to consume mediocre catering, Nor did I come here to offer my congratulations for a painfully average middle management promotion. He paused, letting the crushing, unbearable weight of his words settle over the magnificent hall. Out of the corner of my eye, I watched Marcus. My older brother was swaying slightly, his knuckles turning pure, sickly white as he desperately gripped the edge of a high-top cocktail table for physical support. Exactly 1 hour ago, at 8 o'clock tonight, Elias continued, his tone turning razor-sharp and entirely merciless. The board of directors of the corporation you are all so enthusiastically celebrating officially surrendered their final shares. They unconditionally capitulated to a hostile, total acquisition. As of this exact moment in time, that corporation no longer exists as an independent entity. A horrifying, synchronized gasp erupted from the 500 attendees. Marcus physically stumbled. His knees buckled so severely, he nearly collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor. The supposedly flawless golden boy of the Wilson family was visibly hyperventilating, his perfectly styled hair now matted against his forehead with a layer of cold, terrified sweat. The highly coveted regional manager title he had spent weeks arrogantly boasting about, the prestigious promotion that served as the entire foundation of this extravagant six-figure gala, was nothing but a hollow, meaningless administrative formality processed by a dead, bankrupt company just moments before it was entirely swallowed alive. Elias was not finished. He tightened his grip on the microphone, his posture radiating pure, unyielding dominance. "The acquiring entity," the billionaire declared, his voice cutting through the rising panic like a heavy steel blade, "is Aegis Vanguard Systems. They have aggressively purchased 100% of the assets, the corporate liabilities, and the employment contracts." Elias slowly lowered the microphone, locking his piercing, icy gaze directly onto my brother's terrified, pale face from across the vast room. "You are no longer a regional executive, Marcus," Elias stated coldly, ruthlessly stripping away the final, pathetic shred of my brother's dignity in front of the entire elite social class of Austin. "You are simply an inherited liability, and the absolute authority who holds the power of life and death over your career. The sole individual who will decide if you are unceremoniously terminated with 0 severance pay tomorrow morning is the exact same woman you confidently ordered to sit beside the kitchen garbage." The silence that followed was absolute, terrifying, and profoundly destructive. The glittering, carefully curated illusion of the Wilson family dynasty shattered into a million irreparable pieces on the scuffed linoleum floor. The man who had spent his entire life being blindly worshipped and rewarded for his wildly mediocre existence was now entirely, hopelessly at the mercy of the sister he had ruthlessly cast aside. The extravagant promotion gala disintegrated faster than a structure made of dry sand caught in a hurricane. Within 10 minutes of Elias Thorne's devastating announcement, the grand ballroom of the country club was completely deserted. The elite socialites, the venture capitalists, and the politicians fled the scene as if the very air around my family had turned toxic. They scrambled for the exit, desperate to distance themselves from the catastrophic social and professional suicide they had just witnessed. I did not stay to watch the catering staff nervously clear away the untouched plates of filet mignon. I grabbed my coat from the back of the flimsy plastic chair, bypassed the empty VIP tables, and walked out through the heavy mahogany doors into the cool, crisp Texas night. The valet rushed to bring my car around, practically trembling as he handed me the keys. Just as I reached the door handle, frantic, heavy footsteps echoed rapidly across the damp pavement of the parking lot. "Olivia, please, sweetheart, wait." I turned around slowly. Arthur was sprinting toward me, his expensive tailored tuxedo completely disheveled, his silk tie hanging loosely around his neck. Right behind him dragged Marcus, looking like a man who was walking to his own execution. My father crashed to a halt a few feet away from me. He immediately burst into loud theatrical tears. His chest heaved, and he reached out with shaking hands, trying to grab my arm. But looking into his bloodshot eyes, I saw absolutely no genuine remorse for the decades of psychological neglect or the humiliating spectacle beside the trash bin. I only saw sheer, unadulterated panic. He was weeping because the ultimate, unimaginable gold mine had been sitting right under his roof for 30 years, and he had spent every single day treating it like dirt. He was terrified of losing access to the absolute pinnacle of power he had worshipped his entire life. "You have to forgive your old man," Arthur sobbed, wiping his face in a grotesque display of fake vulnerability. "I was blind. I was foolish. But we are family, Olivia. We are blood. We can rule this city together now. You and me. Just give me a chance to make it right, to be the father you deserve." Before I could respond, Marcus shoved his way forward. His hands were clasped together, his face slick with nervous sweat. "Olivia, listen to me," Marcus stammered, his voice cracking violently. "I am sorry, okay? I am so incredibly sorry for tonight, for everything, but you cannot fire me tomorrow morning. You just cannot do that. I just signed the paperwork for a $3 million mansion in the hills on a 30-year installment plan. If I lose my executive salary, the bank will seize everything. I will be ruined. Please, just let me keep the regional director title. I will do whatever you want." I looked at the two men standing under the flickering yellow light of the parking lot lamppost. I did not scream. I did not hurl insults, and I felt absolutely no desire to completely destroy them through a raging fit of vengeance. They were already broken. I calmly unclasped my leather handbag and reached inside. I pulled out a thick, legally binding corporate restructuring contract, printed on premium parchment paper, and held it out toward my brother. "I am not firing you, Marcus," I said, my voice completely steady and devoid of any emotional attachment. "But I have officially stripped away every single one of your managerial privileges. Your corporate credit cards are canceled. Your corner office is being cleared out tonight. As of tomorrow morning, you are officially demoted to a standard entry-level data entry clerk. You will sit in a cubicle. You will clock in at 8 o'clock in the morning. You will finally learn how to climb up the corporate ladder using your own actual merit, completely cut off from your reliance on the empty umbrella of nepotism." Marcus stared at the papers in my hand, his mouth hanging open in silent, suffocating despair. He realized instantly that his life of unearned luxury was permanently over. I then turned my gaze to Arthur. He was still holding his breath, desperately hoping for a miraculous pardon. I looked right through his pathetic facade, delivering the absolute final judgment that would completely shatter his hollow ideology. "The greatest revenge is not destroying you, Dad," I told him quietly, each word falling like a heavy stone. "The greatest revenge is simply letting you live out the rest of your life knowing that you threw away the most precious thing yourself. You did not lose a billionaire tonight. You just permanently lost a daughter." I did not wait for his response. I turned my back, stepped into the driver's seat of my waiting car, and firmly closed the heavy door, sealing out the damp night air. Through the thick, soundproof glass, I could faintly hear Arthur screaming my name, his voice echoing desperately into the silent Austin night, but I did not roll down the window. I put the car in drive and pressed the accelerator. Glancing up into the rearview mirror one final time, I watched the tragic scene fade into the distance. Arthur had collapsed onto his knees on the concrete pavement, completely defeated, right next to the massive, glittering promotional sign bearing my brother's name that was now tearing and falling apart in the wind. I reached over to the dashboard console, selected the entire contact folder for my family, and permanently deleted their phone numbers from my encrypted system. I took a deep, grounding breath. The heavy, suffocating weight I had carried since childhood completely evaporated, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute freedom. For the very first time in my 32 years of life, I could breathe perfectly. I smiled, realizing that I would never again need to fight for a flimsy plastic chair at their table. I had already built an entire empire of my own. Thank you so much to all the wonderful listeners of Haley Revenge Stories for staying with me until the very end of this journey. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know your city and country in the comments section below. If you enjoyed today's story and found it meaningful, please consider supporting our channel with just $1. You can easily do this by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by using the PayPal link provided in the video description or the pinned comment. Your generous support allows us to pay our dedicated staff, helping them feed their families and giving us the vital resources to continue creating even better stories for you. Thank you again, and take care.